Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Marcus Peter. I'm joined by my friend Dr. Matthew Bunson, Vice President and Editorial Director of EWTN News, talking about church news and current events in light of church teaching. And we're going to begin by talking about the Vatican clarifying the Pope's role as universal shepherd. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us, my friend. How are you?
Always good to be with you. Yeah, this has been something of an interesting back and forth, hasn't it, between certainly the U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See, Brian Burch, and Andrea Tornielli, I think his editorial director is the full title for Vatican Communications, on some comments that Ambassador Burch supposedly made to the New York Times last week.
It's an interesting distinction that they're trying to draw here. Are people really questioning that the Catholic Pope pretends to be anything but universal shepherd?
Yeah, it's on both sides. In fact, I would encourage everyone to go to ncregister.com and read Andrea Gagliarducci's analysis of this. He has a great take where he sort of calls into question both sides in this conversation. The first on the part of the U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See, Brian Burch, questioning that, making the assertion that when Pope Leo actually spoke out against the war in Iran, he was, quote, not doing so as a leader of the Roman Catholic Church, the Vicar of Christ. And then Andrea Tornielli in his editorial making the point that the Pope is always speaking as the Vicar of Christ. Now, I think the argument is correct and not necessarily complete in both cases, and we can unpack that a little bit. But I think it raises some really interesting classic questions about differentiating the different hats or zucchetta that a pope may actually zucchetti that a pope may actually wear, because he is in fact the obviously head of the church, but he is also head of the Vatican City State, and the Holy See has that international status, and the Vatican City State comprising basically what is left of the longstanding territorial possessions of the popes. So it is a complicated historical diplomatic reality, and sometimes the wires get crossed, and it's not necessarily articulated quite properly.
I tip my hat off to you for that very clever play on words, my friend. As you said, it's a problem in communication. I wonder if we could also just very briefly address the global paradigm problem, that they seem to be unable to think of the world's most prominent spiritual leader as anything outside of that primary category.
Yeah, I think there are multiple risks here, and we've seen that in the way that some secular leaders, some secular outlets over the decades have tried to dismiss comments by the Pope on both sides. And a couple of good examples. The first would be when John Paul II, for example, weighed in on so many of the crises that we have seen against communism, against socialism, which certainly is in the news today, his concerns for the dignity of the human person, as we saw in the time that he was Pope, the escalation of abortion. He was roundly dismissed in some quarters as just a religious leader weighing in, giving his religious opinion. But on the other hand, when he spoke out against the Iraq war, he was hailed as the conscience of the world. So it very much depends on one's perspective and what the policy that might be raised. Obviously, from the Church's position, we see very important distinctions between something like abortion, euthanasia, which is intrinsically evil. We have the question of just war as it relates now to this conflict between the United States and Iran, and that the Pope has weighed in on that. And I don't think anyone looking at his comments on the question of just war saw it simply that he was speaking out as the head of state in a diplomatic sense. I think he was, in fact, bringing to bear the Church's teachings on this, in this case, very much as a voice of conscience, but also a voice of warning and concern, understanding historically, as we saw certainly with the Iraq War in 2003, where this can go.
Andrea's piece also highlights the fact that and you've already alluded to this, that even when he's speaking diplomatically, we cannot make the mistake of thinking that he is representing the Holy See the way, say, a U.S. president represents the United States. No, he is Bishop of Rome, so quite literally he is the Holy See. Please help us understand that distinction.
Yeah, that's right. So the Holy Father holds that very unique position that everything is vested in him. Mm-hmm. He is, from a standpoint of law, but also of international diplomacy, he is the embodiment of the Holy See. And as such, he speaks from that dimension. But that dimension is profoundly spiritual, obviously. He is vicar of Christ. And yes, you have these temporal holdings of the Vatican City State and what are called extraterritorial possessions. And yes, the Holy See has diplomatic relations with 150 plus countries around the world. The exchange of nuncios and apostolic delegates and the reception of ambassadors. But at its heart, he is the head of the church. He is the vicar of Christ, as we were saying. And so you can't really differentiate then between that he simply is not representing or speaking for an international body. He is, in fact, the Holy See. And I think I appreciate that you wanted to raise that. Now, let's look back in history. It has been necessary historically for the popes to have temporal possessions. Why? Partly because they were gifted those, they were granted those territories, but also at a time when something like Italy never existed. And during the medieval era, especially in some of the darker periods of medieval history, the popes had these papal states, governed them as temporal rulers, if for no other reason, as a way of preventing exactly what happened in 1870, which was the occupation of Rome, the seizure of papal territories, and, as we have seen throughout history, the efforts on the part of some secular regimes to control the papacy, and with all of the dimensions that would bring. So there was this historical need for it. That was obliterated basically in 1860 and then especially in 1870 with the seizure of Rome, when Pope Pius IX declared himself the so-called prisoner of the Vatican. That was resolved to some degree in 1929 with the Lateran Accords, the agreement basically between Italy and the Holy See about the formal status of Vatican of the Church's possessions. The Vatican City State was created as the smallest country in the world. We all know that. But that then also allows for a small part of that continuation of that need for the popes to be able to have a territory of their own, to call their own if for no other reason, for their own safety. But then that also gives the opportunity for the unique diplomatic existence of the Holy See to have a spot somewhere from which it can function.
And we can recognize the necessity of both. I think just to finish off this segment and this part of the conversation, it is therefore crucial for us to understand that despite the interchangeable Zucchetti that he can, if I may borrow the
absolutely
that he interchanges, he still cloaks that with a mitre, and so he rightly remains Bishop of Rome and therefore prime bishop over the bishops of Christ.
That's absolutely right. And one final point, too, on the question of the diplomatic necessity of things, that it is the very existence of the Holy See as an international body with the Vatican City State as its territory that allows also the popes to engage in key and very important diplomatic initiatives to prevent war, to bring humanitarian aid, to have the voice of the Church heard in the diplomatic spheres and the crises that we're facing. You can see how that works in both of those fashions. The way that Pope Leo XIV has addressed the whole AI question and the questions of war and peace.
Well, this is Dr. Matthew Bunson, Vice President and Editorial Director of EWTN News. We're going to continue on the other side of the break. We're talking about, right now, Pope Leo XIV and his rightful clarified role as being both head of state and truly Bishop of Rome and therefore shepherd of the world. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Speed. I'm talking with Dr. Matthew Bunson, Vice President, Editorial Director of EWTN News. We're talking about church news right now and current events in light of church teaching. Matthew, as you alluded to earlier, communism factors into today's conversation. So the Vatican-Beijing agreement, what do we... I know there's so much we still don't know about it. What do we know about it right now?
Well, what we know is first the history of it, and that is that we go back to 2018, I believe, that this was first worked out between the Holy See and authorities in Beijing. The purpose of it, this is where a lot of confusion has existed, really from the beginning of this, because at first it was thought that this was some sort of a process for diplomatic relations. Yes, there is a diplomatic element to this, but really this was specifically crafted to look for a way to find a mutual path to the appointment, the selection, appointment, and then installation and, as necessary, consecration or ordination of bishops. So it's really been about the bishops. And from that standpoint, it has been renewed several times. I think most recently in 2024, basically for another 4 years. So this is the reality of the relationship between the Holy See and Beijing in terms of the bishops through 2028. Let's remember that there are no formal diplomatic relations that exist between the Holy See and China. They haven't existed since, I think, 1951 under the regime, the communist regime of Mao Zedong. So while Mao was slaughtering millions and millions of his own people, he was also introducing one of the most severe persecutions of religion, certainly in the history of China, and in some ways a not unprecedented but a shocking persecution of religion in human history. So that is sort of a background to why, in some ways, any agreement like this can be helpful. But we also have the background of how the Holy See has historically, certainly over the last century, dealt with different communist regimes. And one of the ways that they do that is to find ways to achieve some forms of cooperation. Mm-hmm. We saw that in what's called Ostpolitik, with the appointment of bishops in the Soviet era, in places like Poland and elsewhere. We have seen similar arrangements with Vietnam, which itself, let's remember, is a communist regime. So this falls within that wider historical structure. And this is something that Pope Leo has inherited. And so far, there have been multiple violations on the part of the Chinese government, on the part of Beijing. But it is a process that continues. And we saw that just recently with the appointment of a new bishop by Pope Leo just a few days ago.
If you would please humor me in your wisdom to talk about an ancillary topic that pertains to what Pope Leo and his magisterium are doing here. There was some criticism against the magisterium for how it was responding to the SSPX, and some of that criticism levied how the church is responding to Beijing and why the former can't receive the privileges of the latter. But we're really looking at categorical differences here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the SSPX, by its own statements, declares itself to be a Catholic institution and therefore professes to be subject to the teachings of the Church, to the authority of the Church. No such claim is made by the People's Republic of China. Quite the opposite. In fact, the People's Republic of China has, for decades now, persecuted the church in China, persecuted Catholics, Christians writ large. It has persecuted all religions, as we can see with their treatment of the Uyghurs, the Muslim minorities, certainly in western parts of China. So you use a very important point, Mark, is a very important term, that there are categorical differences here. So making comparisons like that, I think, are not just inadequate, but I think they're completely inaccurate in assessing both situations. And
I mean, dare I say this? It is an affront to the debt of charity, and I guess to a certain degree, the fealty we owe as children of the covenant family to this our spiritual father.
Yes, exactly. And it is, we have to be careful, too, because there are those who would dismiss the Pope as making a mistake either here or there. He is the head of the church, and we don't want to put ourselves in the position of simply dissenting from what the Pope has specifically asked of us as Catholics. In this case, Pope Leo XIV specifically asked the Society of St. Pius X not to proceed with its ordinations of these 4 bishops, with the result that they, by their own actions, excommunicated themselves, to use a technical term, late sententia, by the very act of doing it, and entered into schism. Now, I know that there's a lot of controversy surrounding what the actual decree stipulated and what the explanatory note that accompanied it and everything else. But this is a response to actions on the part of the SSPX in the face of a specific request by the Holy Father not to do this. And I think that speaks for itself. Obviously, when we're talking about something like the People's Republic of China or any of these types of regimes, they consider themselves completely removed. They have no interest in being or pretending to be under the authority of the church.
We can also be some of the first to acknowledge that this is the Leonine Magisterium making the best of what is already a truly bad situation.
That's right. In this case, by the terms of this provisional agreement, and again, let's remember that this is provisional, it has been renewed for a period of time, that this is part of the agreement. So in other words, the Holy Father approved the candidate that was presented for the diocese. Now, what we know from the provisions itself is that it's an effort on the part of the Holy See to find a way forward for the appointment of bishops rather than simply refusing to deal with them at all and either having bishops non-existent in dioceses or having bishops appointed that are exclusively acceptable or named by the communist government. So in other words, you make, again, a very important point that essentially this is trying to find a way forward to have shepherds installed. Now, the Holy See, for its part, agreed not to make episcopal appointments without first obtaining the engagement of the Chinese government, but also, according to this, from what we understand, the Holy Father retains final authority over episcopal appointments and can reject candidates proposed by Beijing. So that means that there is obvious consultation on the part of the Holy See with the Catholics in China. So there is that room, at least, for the Church to maneuver here, where we might not otherwise have any opportunity to do so.
And so we'll thank the Lord for every leeway we receive. Now, I'm going to betray my age, but also express some happy news about France. First European country to ban social media for minors under 15.
Yeah, it's. I think there are some misgivings on the part of some social media experts about this, especially privacy experts. Certainly France, following in the footsteps of Australia, is trying to find a way, this is certainly supported by President Emmanuel Macron, to prevent or protect children who find themselves in this environment. And essentially they've established a digital age of majority, as they say, to protect children online. Now, the two questions that immediately emerge from this is this opening the potential door for violations of privacy? Are there backdoor problems with this that could allow for monitoring people's activities online that you might not otherwise want to have happen? The other is, can, in fact, it be possible to block children completely? We know, for example, that 85% of Australians aged 12 to 15 are still using restricted platforms because there are always workarounds.
Yep. Well, Matthew, as usual, thank you for your generosity and your time and your wisdom.
Great to be with you. Let's keep praying for Catholics in China.
Yep. My guest has been Dr. Matthew Bunson, Vice President, Editorial Director of EWTN News. Thank God for some level of conversation between Rome and China. Let's keep praying for China. I'm Marcus Peter.